The most important metric in training that matters is our total volume of load that we can put on the system. The more training we can get in, the more likely we are to make progress.
Lube your chain and pump up those tires. It's time for Aging on Dirt, where we defy expectations one pedal stroke at a time. We age, but we don't have to get old, and we all want to experience the joy of mountain biking as long as possible. Are you starting to ride at an unreasonable age, getting back into it after a long layoff, or just wanting to extend how long you'll be riding? Then you're in the right place. And now, your host, Joel Zeeve.
I'm so excited to have Dr. Cameron Gerber on the show today, and you'll be too. He's the perfect guest to help us understand how to stay active and experience the joy on our bikes as we continue to age. He's a physical therapist, the owner of Body Smart in South Ogden, Utah, and there he helps people live longer and stronger lives. He does this by helping us improve our mindset and skills that are both needed in order to be that guy or that gal that we see riding on the trails well into our 80s, all without having the fear of injury or burnout. So welcome, Dr. Cameron Garber.
Hi.
Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, my pleasure coming on.
Okay, Cameron. So I've heard from several of my listeners, and also this has kind of popped into my head recently, even though I've only been riding for about 10 years, but a lot of my listeners have been riding, decades. And this concept just keeps coming in and out of vogue, I guess, in popularity. We've heard it called, it's concept of you need to ride slower in order to ride faster. Mm-hmm. We've heard it called an 80-20 rule when it comes to your riding. Recently, it's coming back with vengeance, it seems like, with this whole Zone 2 craze, spending most of your time in Zone 2. And a lot of longevity experts are bringing it back now with the focus on Zone 2. So tell us what this is, and I guess briefly, initially, why it's important and why does it keep coming back and where does it go when it goes away?
Yeah. So let's focus, I guess, first on why it's important. Just very briefly, and then we'll dive into it again later. But the importance comes in, and especially for the master's athlete, I would say, in not over fatiguing oneself, in not
sense.
beating up our bodies so that we have enough energy to keep training. So one of the key principles that we always teach is that the most important metric in training that matters is our total volume of load that we can put on the system. The more training we can get in, the more likely we are to make progress. And so by making sure that we have an adequate volume of low intensity training so that we can get in a high volume, because it's not beating up our body as much, then we have a greater, ability to do the high intensity work as well without getting injured. And so by polarizing our training and making our slow slower and our fast faster, we give ourselves the opportunity to not only get a higher volume of training in, but higher quality training in our high intensity work. So the low intensity work is where we build endurance and just put enough load on the system that it makes our body adapt. The high intensity work is where we really improve performance. And so you have to have a mix of kind of slow, steady training and high intensity training. So that's part of why it's important is you need enough time on the saddle while you're cycling to build a big base. And then you need enough time in high intensity to really make improvement. And what they've shown is that slowing down on our slow actually allows us to go faster during our fast, and we see better improvement in both endurance and in performance. And so that's one of the reasons why this 80-20 keeps coming back into vogue, is it seems to be the magic ratio of the high and low intensity training. And so the way they define high and low intensity is typically in heart rate zones. It's the most predictable or I guess science tested and proven that if you're spending time in zone 2 for 80% of your time, and then zones 4 and 5 for the other 20% of your time, that has seemed to lead to the most optimal result.
Okay. So if I don't race, I'm on my mountain bike just to have fun.
Yeah.
If I feel like it's going to be too much of work for a ride, I may jump on the e-bike instead of the mountain bike and just take it at my own pace. Then why does this even apply to me?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because it's like, should I be training the way elite athletes are training if I'm not an elite athlete? Interestingly enough, it's not necessarily based on what elite athletes are doing as much. That's kind of its foundation. That's how they found the 80-20 ratio, was they started initially just following all endurance athletes, no matter what their discipline was. So cyclists, triathletes, biathlete, rowers, runners, all those things. And then they reverse engineered it based on who was winning long-term and having the fewest injuries, but staying on the podium. And they reverse engineered it and said, okay, it looks like somewhere between 90-10 and 70-30 is what these elite athletes who stay on top for a long time, that's how they're training. And so they were able to take that and say, okay, if this is what the elite athletes are doing, what's the best ratio? And so with a bunch of studies and things like that, they found that 80-20 was the right breakdown for optimal improvement while still building this huge base. So then they decided, well, does this apply to the masters athlete? Does this apply to just somebody looking to lose weight or just to maintain a healthy body? So just kind of your average Joe.
Mm-hmm.
And the science bore out that, yeah, it actually still is the best way to have people trained to, perform their best while avoiding injury. That's one of the biggest keys, is the injury avoidance.
That's what it comes down to, right?
So the other factor I would argue is, injury avoidance and maximizing performance. But if you're just a Wally weekender, the weekend warrior, why does it matter to maximize my performance? I would argue that it's because the idea that maintenance is a lie. And we mentioned this on our last call,
right?
That if we're just maintaining, we're actually declining. Just riding the same way, the same, moderate intensity, that zone 3 ride where we huff and puff and we feel pretty tired at the end, but we didn't really go fast. So we didn't improve our performance, and we didn't go long enough in this low zone 2 where we're just building this huge base. Then we're actually not keeping up with aging, if that makes sense. We're beating ourselves up enough that we can't have the volume of training that we need to actually truly maintain. So we slow down more and more over the years. By following 80-20 and polarizing our training more, slower on our slow and faster on our fast, what that allows us to do is slow down the slowing down of aging. We're able to keep making subtle improvements that fights off the natural decline with aging. And so that's what we're really looking to do with zone 2 training, or this 80-20 idea, is we can fight off the slowing down. We can maintain our fitness and keep growing our fitness. And I think the biggest advantage is we can increase our total volume of training. Because most of what we're doing is the slow, steady training, it makes it so that we're not beating our body up enough that we can train with higher volume Whereas if we're going zone 3, we can't train as often. We have to take more days off, and we're less capable of pushing ourselves on our hard days without having negative consequences, injury and the like.
Okay,
So,
that makes sense.
yeah. Often you'll see recommendations that the master athlete not train every day, that they take more days off in between. And I would argue that that's unnecessary as long as we're slowing down enough in our slow. That the recovery time needed is because that extra recovery time anyway is because we're pushing too hard. We're in that moderate zone of moderate intensity, and your body just can't keep up as well in that moderate intensity. And so you need more days off. Whereas if we train lighter, we can keep our training volume up in terms of number of minutes. And that's one of the areas where I'd argue that minutes matter more than miles. We tend to think of our training in miles, or sometimes with mountain biking, it's laps up and down the mountain or things like that. I would argue that it's the amount of time that we spend cycling, the amount of activity time that we're putting in is more important than the number of miles that we achieve. And so the more time we spend in each of those zones, the more training effect we're going to have.
Clearly, if you need a logical reason to get an e-bike, this is certainly it. It's really the only way that we're going to be able to get zone 2 rides in on dirt single track. That being said, I can see this being a massive paradigm shift for a lot of people, really including myself. So I'll give you an example. It's probably been 3, maybe 4 years where I was specifically training for the 12-hour mountain bike race, Aldose, up at Powder Mountain. The entire summer leading up to this, my approach was going on long rides and building the length of those rides over the course of the summer, with the idea of 2 to 3 weeks before this event, I would be comfortable at a pace that I wanted to ride at for a good, say, 7, 8, maybe 9 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing that, as I tapered, then, a couple weeks later, the 12-hour event, I'd go into that comfortable knowing that I would be able to handle that kind of pace.
Mm-hmm.
But during this training, those rides were almost exclusively zone 3 the whole time. And the reason I think it's going to be a paradigm shift for a lot of people, including me, is I could look at that and say, hey, that worked. I made it through that 12-hour race. I achieved the goal that I had for it, and I felt good. Well, except for the last lap. It was a lot longer than I thought, but that's a whole nother story. So from what I hear you saying, Cameron, and from what the research is saying, is that if I had done approach that training coming up to that race with the 80-20 principle, I would have been in much better condition to perform better than I actually did.
Yeah. You could have made more progress. Likely. I mean, it's hard to say, completely in hindsight, I guess. But the science would support that you could have gone further, potentially, faster, during that same time window or whatever. I guess one of the primary outcomes too is that you feel better along the way. Mm-hmm. That you're less beat up from each training cycle because you went slow enough and you could get more training volume in. And so in the running world, they talk a lot about negative splits, that as the race goes on, that your times start to drop versus sustaining the same, minutes per mile in the first half of a race as the second half of the race. Did you have negative or positive splits, right? Were you losing time? Were you bleeding time? Or were you gaining time on yourself? Could you finish strong? And that's where we often see a big difference, is people more able to finish strong when they train with that 80-20 because they have enough gas in the tank. They've trained their body to burn fat more efficiently, more effectively. And so they can go longer and higher into their heart rate range before they really have exhausted carbohydrate reserves and things like that. Their mix of fuel being burned is leaning more towards fat burning, and so the carb reserves and the carbohydrate they're intaking is being used as fuel instead of having to rely as heavily on the reserves. And so that's part of the idea behind that slow, steady training. So could you have improved? Likely so, yeah. I would argue that no matter how our race goes, there's probably ways that we could have improved, right?
Sure.
So it's not necessarily a knock on your training as much as was that really optimal for you to make maximal progress. Now, there's always the argument, yeah, but I enjoyed it. I loved every ride and I did well enough. And that's okay. The one risk being that injury rates increase when training that way. And especially when people try to make a push to improve. You may get to where your body can tolerate that zone 3 load for those long rides pretty well. You adapt to that somewhat because you've been doing that for a while. And so that's maybe not as harmful. Again, you may not be able to increase your training volume very much, though. If you go to say like, oh, that worked really well. And so for the next race, you're like, I'm going to train that way, but I'm going to push my pace a little bit. That's usually where we see the injuries come in when people try to take that next step, when they try to make that, next improvement. And so they push a little harder or go a little longer, and it's just beyond what their current capacity is to handle.
Okay.
That's often where we see injuries come in is when people make a push to improve performance.
Okay.
And don't honor kind of that 80-20 ratio.
So back to this race. So if I were to train with the 80-20 principle, very little time in zone 3 throughout this training period. And then on race day, almost that entire race is zone 3.
Right.
Explain to me how not training in zone 3, but racing 12 hours in zone 3. So if I'm not spending time in zone 3, how do I get my body used to zone 3 for the race?
So a couple of ways. One, you're used to, if you're doing the 80-20, you're actually used to pushing your body much, much harder than zone 3. So zone 3,
but for a much shorter period of time.
For a shorter period of time.
I don't have my body would not have any experience for an extended period of time, hours and hours and hours in zone 3.
So what happens with your zone 3? As you train more in zone 2, your zone 2 grows.
Okay.
And so your zone 3 becomes a very narrow window. And so that's one of the things with elite athletes. Their zone 3 and their zone 2 and their zone 4 are actually pretty tight with one another. They become increasingly smaller gap between zone 2 and zone 4, and zone 3 almost shrinks away because they're able to push where they're burning a high percentage of fat and still aerobically very efficient into much higher into your heart rate range. And so what you're essentially doing is you're getting better output than you were in zone 3 traditionally, but still being in zone 2. That's one of the hallmarks of zone 3 is that's kind of where your new natural pace is. And so it's faster than it used to be. But so no matter how fit we are, we still have to slow down a bit to get into zone 2. But what zone 2 is now is faster than what your zone 3 used to be for many people if they stick with it for long enough.
So Cameron, we've got these 5 different zones, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I know, and I've gone through this process with you, which was incredibly valuable and educational to me, and I probably need to do it again. Where you've actually put me on a bike in your office and gave me a graph when we were done, so I knew exactly what my heart rates were in each of the 5 zones. which helped me with my training. If we don't go through that process with you, if we're not that much of a data geek or we're not that entirely serious about whatever we're training for, what guidance can you give us so we can take what we know about our bodies and get an idea which zone we're in when we're riding?
Okay. So there's a lot of different systems. So for training for a specific event, especially if you're looking to compete, I prefer a 5-zone system. If you're just training for life, there's kind of 4 zones. Then one is recovery zone, which is just, barely moving. So walk or just a gentle ride, no resistance, flat ground, just barely moving, right? So you wouldn't even consider it effort or exercise. It's just like staying upright on your bike. Zone 1, recovery, cool down, like a cool down pace. So I really talk about 3 different zones that are of import. So the first zone is what I call, it's your easy pace. It's your I could do this forever zone. So your comfortable zone is what I like to call it. So this is your comfortable zone. I can do this all day. It's no big deal. It feels easy, too easy to feel like a workout. That's your comfortable zone. That equates to zones 1 and 2.
Okay.
The top end of the comfortable zone is like, I could do this for several hours, but I don't know if I could do it all day per se. But 4, 5, 6 hours, if I'm well trained, I could do that fairly easily in this zone.
Okay, so even at the top of zone 2, you're not even really out of breath at any point?
You're able to hold a conversation. Maybe like you're able to hold a conversation. You have to stop to breathe every so often, but you're able to hold a conversation just fine.
Okay.
You're not like we are quite. I mean, this is a little too casual to be, in an exercise mode. But you should be able to hold a conversation pretty well, where it's not just short statements, right?
So if I had you on my Bluetooth when I was riding my bike, you may or may not be able to tell that I was riding it based on my breathing patterns.
Yeah, I should be able to tell, but it wouldn't be like waiting for you to take a breath before you have to say your next phrase, if that makes sense. So you'd in the natural flow of the conversation, you'd be able to get enough breathing in, if that makes sense. But you wouldn't be able to just constantly talk. The next zone equates with zone 3, and that's the comfortably uncomfortable zone. A half hour to an hour and a half, maybe even longer if I'm well trained. But I couldn't do it forever, and it makes me tired to be in this zone. It's uncomfortable, but I kind of like the discomfort, this comfortably uncomfortable zone.
Feels like I'm working.
Yeah, it feels like I'm working, but like within a zone that for my normal daily workout, I could do this every day and I enjoy it.
Okay.
So, and then the last zone is the uncomfortably uncomfortable. So I'm working really hard and I can only sustain this for a short window of time. Again, depending on how well trained we are, some people can manage zone 4 for hour and a half even, but that's really, really long unless you're really well trained. But zone 4 and zone 5 would be this uncomfortably uncomfortable. Like, that when you start going this hard that the clock's ticking on how long you can sustain it. For most people, half hour is kind of an upper limit of zone 4, down to about 15 minutes at the top end. And most people are zone 5 can go like a few minutes at the most. And some people that are well trained can go, 15 minutes or more for the uber elite athletes.
Oh.
And so with those 3 zones, then the comfortable, the comfortably uncomfortable, and the uncomfortably uncomfortable, we should only spend time at the top and bottom. At the comfortable, I can do this all day. And that's kind of the point, is that I can do it all day and I can do it again the next day and the next and the next. And it's not beating up my body. It's not creating undue load on the system. And then the rest of the time, I want to be in that uncomfortably uncomfortable zone where I'm pushing my limits and growing. So the comfortably uncomfortable is there's no comfort or there's no growth in the comfort zone, right? So if we're in this comfortably uncomfortable zone, we're not progressing. That's the problem with it. It's the no progress zone. It's not that it's not good for our body in terms of our heart and our lungs and all those things, but it's not fast enough to push our fitness forward. And it's not going to be long enough to really make those long-term adaptations in fat burning and endurance building and things like that.
Okay.
And so it's the no progress zone is kind of one of the other nicknames I have for it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the problem with zone 3 training is it's the no progress zone.
And the other part of it is it's also the most fun zone to be in.
Yeah, it is the most fun zone. It's where our natural pace tends to be. It's where if we were just to go out on a ride or go out on a run or row a rowing machine or things like that, we tend to choose that pace because it feels hard. But not so hard that I can't sustain it, that I'm suffering and miserable. That's kind of that zone 4, zone 5. But that's why the zone 4, zone 5 pushes us to get better. The zone 3, we tend to make progress up to a point, and then we plateau. And our paces don't really get faster. Our times don't get faster. Our power doesn't really increase. We kind of hit this plateau. We hold steady there for years sometimes where people's performance doesn't really improve.
Mm-hmm.
And then they either slowly decline with age or they push harder to improve. So they do zone 3 and then try to add some zone 4, zone 5 stuff. And that's where they get injured.
Gotcha.
And so that's, that comfortably uncomfortable. It's a no growth zone.
Mm-hmm.
So we either want to be comfortable where we're just putting volume of training, but very little load. Or we want to be maximizing that load for a shorter window of time that's really going to push our progress. And what that does, that mix, is it grows how big our comfort zone is and shrinks our comfortably uncomfortable zone and grows our uncomfortably uncomfortable zone so that we can push harder at being uncomfortable and we can push harder at being comfortable. And our comfortably, the no progress zone shrinks in terms of our heart rate range. So I'll have even masters athletes get into their mid 140s, 150s and still be burning a high percentage of fat. And so that's really fun when you can see somebody grow their heart rate ranges to where they're able to push pretty hard and generate a lot of power. People that are 250, 300 watts and still burning mostly fat.
Wow.
That makes it so that they can sustain high intensity work for a really long period of time.
Sure.
It's not common, I would say, but I would also argue it's because most people hang out. They don't earn that over time. They just start at I can produce 250 watts. And so they start riding there and spend too much time at the edge of their capacity. And don't drop way below that and build a big old base and then go higher than that to push how far that base grows.
Okay.
Hopefully that makes sense.
Right. Okay. Cameron, this has just been absolutely amazing and mind-opening for me. I'm sure it has been for my listeners too. So I guess if we were to wrap this up, briefly wrap it up, what would be a couple pieces of advice that you would give us all going forward to help us keep this information in mind?
Yeah, I would say kind of the biggest thing is make sure you're taking care of your body so that you can recover well. And one of the ways that we can set ourselves up for success there is following that 80-20. 80% in that comfortable zone where we can recover more quickly so that we can spend more time training. And then a few bouts a week where we're pushing that high end in that uncomfortably uncomfortable zone where we're growing how much we can do and really pushing our limits. And by doing that, we're going to defy aging and be able to stay on the road for longer, maintain our performance, and be able to enjoy things for years to come instead of slowly declining with every passing year.
That was great. Thanks so much, Cameron. Just a couple quick post-interview notes here. I'm still learning how to do these podcasts and conduct these interviews. So I ask all of you and Cameron for forgiveness here. I didn't give him an opportunity to let you all know where to find him and to promote his business. Personally, I've been to see Cameron several times over the last few years. The most notable was his metabolic testing, which really helped me understand where my heart rate zones are so I could better prepare for long endurance rides like El Doce and the 6 and 12 hour rides. Metabolically, zone 2 ends and zone 3 starts when you start burning more carbs than fat. So Cameron can determine exactly when that happens. Since you have virtually unlimited amounts of fat you can burn compared to the limited amounts of carbs, you can see how you can ride much longer by remaining in zone 2 as long as you can. You can find Cameron's contact information and information about his services on his website at bodysmart.life, Life. And BodySmart is just all one word. And he most certainly will be on the show again. We have more great topics regarding aging on dirt for us to cover for you.
Well, that's another lap around the bike park for Aging on Dirt. I hope you've learned something and/or found this entertaining. Most importantly, go out and apply what you've learned so you can experience more joy on your bike. Remember, Joel wants your input. What topics and/or guests do you want to hear? Reach out to him where you're listening to the podcast, on Facebook, or find his email/phone on his coaching website, jzmtb.com. Until next time, have fun and be safe out there.